For our fourth video, we're going to be discussing the Progressive Era and also imperialism. Imperialism actually covers both the Spanish-American War and World War I. Our focus, however, for this activity is going to be with the Spanish-American War. So our overall goals are to differentiate between the populist and the progressives as we move into the progressive movement, and then also develop an understanding of American imperialism and how it shaped America's future endeavors. You should have already finished all the pages that I'm scrolling through now. If not, you need to go back to the other videos and watch those before proceeding. So starting with the Progressive Era, when it's asking to compare and contrast, it's comparing to the Gilded Age, which was our last video. So compared to the Gilded Age, the progressive movement is a shift from the power being in the hands of the few, and it's talking about the wealthy industrialist, and the power goes back to the people. And this is done through different government regulation and also constitutional change. So this is going to be what the Progressive Era is all about: progressing into the future, making a change for the better, and giving that power back to the people. Very often, students will mix up the populist and the progressives. So we're going to take a moment here and distinguish between the two. So starting with the origins for the populist, this is going to be centered in rural America. In other words, this is going to be your farmers. Progressives, however, are centered in cities. So the membership, as I just said, is mainly Southern and Western farmers for the populist party. For progressives, however, it's going to be mainly well-educated urban whites. For the overall economic goals and reforms, for each of these, you're going to have 4 goals and reforms. So you're going to want to save yourself enough space to write this, or you may even need an extra piece of paper to fit all the information. So starting with the populist, the first goal is the government ownership of railroads. This is because during the time period, during the Gilded Age, railroads were really starting to be run by these wealthy industrialists, which was hurting farmers the most. The second economic goal or reform is government ownership of natural resources. The next one is a graduated income tax, which actually would end up passing. And then also the use of silver to increase the nation's money supply. This, however, would not be an item that would be passed. Progressives would also agree in the government regulation of railroads and other big businesses. They wanted the government to step in order to break apart these different monopolies and trusts. They also wanted government protection and conservation of natural resources, graduated income tax, just like the populist, and a national banking system in order to control the nation's money supply. The next topic is going to be political goals and reforms. For the populists, the first one is going to be a secret ballot. And this is to avoid different corruption in terms of intimidation when it came to voting. The next one is women's suffrage. This does not mean suffering. This is talking about women's right to vote. The next one is initiative, referendum, and recall. And these are defined. If you scroll down and you look at your vocabulary down here, they're actually defined for you. So if you're unsure about what those terms mean, you should reference down here in the essential vocab. The last one is going to be direct election of U.S. senators. Progressives would also agree that a secret ballot is important. Women's suffrage is essential. Initiative, referendum, and recall. And also the direct election of U.S. senators. If we go back to our amendments page, this is when I told you that some of these were actually referred to as the Progressive Movement Amendments, 16, 17, 18, and 19. Right here you have a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition, and then women's suffrage. That's why it's referred to as the Progressive Movement. Remember, it's 16 tax dollars for 17 senators to buy 18 drinks for 19 women. Our last section then is social goals or social reforms. Overall, when referring to populists, they were pretty divided on terms of prohibition. Remember, prohibition is banning the sale and manufacturing of alcohol. They wanted a shorter workday. They wanted to restrict immigration, focus on rural America, since remember they are farmers, and help those farmers and rural America. Progressives, however, supported prohibition. During this time period, alcohol was really blamed for a lot of the crime and corruption, and it was thought that by banning alcohol, crime would decrease. They also supported a shorter workday. They, however, wanted to help immigrants, have more of a focus on urban America, and help cities and urban workers and residents. So this is definitely more focused on the city. Remember, urban means city. I'm going to pause it now to give you a moment to catch up. After this, then we're going to work on the Spanish-American War content. Now that we're moving on to the Spanish-American War, you should have this paper in front of you, and we're going to complete the squares that are empty. So starting with the causes of the Spanish-American War, 1898, the first one is the Cuban Revolution, followed by humanitarian concerns, then yellow journalism, U.S. imperialism, the Dulome Letter, and the sinking of the USS Maine. So mine are off from the arrows over here, but you understand that's where you would organize this so it lines up and makes more sense. Okay, over here for the different courses and consequences, please include the Rough Riders, the victory in Cuba, and Dewey in the Philippines. Other courses and consequences of the Spanish-American War include that Spain loses Cuba. They also lose the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Additionally, U.S. will gain former Spanish possessions, referring to resources, natural resources. In terms of imperialism, knowing what imperialism is, it's the idea of expansionism, and sometimes the words are used interchangeably. The idea that by expanding out and controlling other geographic areas, it gives you more power, gives you more control, it gives the government this sense of nationalism and this idea that they can really have more control over world affairs. So some other motives for imperialism include this need for raw materials and markets, You should be aware of who Alfred Thayer Mahan is. In your vocab section, it has more of a description of him, but he was definitely someone who actively spoke for and was pro-imperialism. Another reason is competition with European powers. And then the last one is to spread civilization. This has to do with Christianity and missionaries. Okay, so we have our causes of the Spanish-American War, and this is something that you can talk with your teacher or go back to your notes in order to discuss. You have the courses and the consequences. Courses, make sure with Rough Riders that you have Teddy Roosevelt. And then the different consequences. Why do we care about imperialism and expanding out? Here are your motives. And then the American colonial empire. So we have the Caribbean and Puerto Rico, Cuba. Also add down here the Panama Canal, which was established in 1904. Furthermore, the Teller Amendment. And then also the Platt Amendment. In terms of the Pacific, you have Midway, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, and Samoa. In Latin America, one important aspect or corollary that you need to know is the Roosevelt corollary in order to help diplomacy and also trade in Latin America. You have the U.S. intervention in the Caribbean. Again, you have the Panama Canal. Taft would establish dollar diplomacy. And then Woodrow Wilson, would refer to Mexico in saying that he was being watchful and waiting. In China, you have the open door policy in terms of trade, but you also have the Boxer Rebellion. For our content in U.S. history, you don't need to know very much about the Boxer Rebellion. It's just giving you a frame of reference of our imperialism during the time period. Opening of Japan, again, it's just information to help give you a grasp on imperialism, but the Russo-Japanese War, and then also the Treaty of Portsmouth. So when you're done, here's all the content that you should have included. If you have any questions about the specifics, especially when it comes to yellow journalism, knowing what yellow journalism is, the Cuban Revolution, all of these causes are really important and you'll be responsible for knowing. Same with the courses and the consequences. Imperialism in East Asia, yes, it's important, but you don't have to go into too much detail. Latin America, definitely knowing this content. And then the overall Pacific consequences of imperialism. And same with down here, the Platt Agreement and the Teller Amendment. Alfred Thayer Mahan, like I said, is also included in your vocab. This right here, this need for raw materials, is always a big content area to know. So if it asks anything about why imperialism is important, what are our motives, you should automatically be thinking raw materials and different markets for trade.